The deep space research vessel Odyssey floats in a perfect silence. Its crew hears a signal from the void, a distorted whisper repeating a single chilling phrase. It sees you. Long-range sensors then detect a massive object moving towards them, something that should not exist in the emptiness. By the end of this story, you will understand the true terror waiting in the dark between galaxies. What is the nature of the signal, and what does it want with them? What would you do if the silence of space suddenly spoke your name? The silence on the Odyssey's bridge became a physical weight. Captain Valerius' voice cut through it, low and steady. All stop. Hold position. Through the main viewport, the starfield was being erased. A colossal shape slid into view, a deeper black than the space around it, a geometric wound in the cosmos. It drank the light from distant suns, offering no reflection, no detail, only a perfect, impenetrable absence. Ensign Rirk's voice was a tight wire of controlled panic. It is not on any chart, Captain. Long range, short range, even the lateral arrays. Scanners show absolutely nothing. It is a perfect void. The tension in the air was now a sharp, metallic taste. This was not a planet, not a nebula, not any natural phenomenon. They were looking at an artificial object, a constructed thing of such impossible scale that it defied every law of physics they knew. It was architecture for giants, and it hung in the void as if it had been waiting for them. The debate on the bridge fractured the tense silence into two opposing fronts. Science Officer Lin's voice was a calm, insistent counterpoint to the visual horror outside. "We cannot assume intent, Captain. First contact protocol is clear. We send a passive probe, gather data, and make no aggressive moves. Direct contact is a violation of everything we were trained for." Her hands moved over her console, already preparing a probe launch sequence. On the other side of the bridge, Security Chief Drake stood with his arms crossed, his gaze locked on the void. Protocol was written for known threats, for other ships or biological entities. This is unknown. That thing out there is a predator's shadow. We need to be ready for anything, and that means powering up defensive systems now. The division was clear, a microcosm of the fundamental human conflict between the drive to understand and the instinct to survive. Before Captain Valerius could render a decision, a new alert blared across the bridge. Something shifted on the edge of the colossal structure. A smaller shape, a mere shard compared to the whole, detached itself. It moved with a purpose that was anything but random, accelerating towards the Odyssey with impossible speed. It was not a probe. It was not a greeting. It was a spear, hurled directly at them from the heart of the darkness. The spear of darkness resolved into a form of chilling simplicity. It was a perfect cube, no larger than a human head, its surface an unbroken plane of absolute black. It made no sound as it approached, a silent bullet against the starfield, until it settled against the Odyssey's outer hull with a soft, magnetic thud that resonated through the ship's skeleton. On the bridge, every screen flickered for a single, heart-stopping moment. It had docked itself. Science Officer Lin's analysis was a quiet recitation of the impossible. Scans show no seams, no welds, not even microscopic imperfections. It is a single, continuous surface. There are no energy signatures, no radiation, no heat. It is either completely inert, or it is in a state of perfect hibernation. Her voice dropped lower, waiting. The debate that followed was a raw, human thing. "We should jettison it now," Chief Drake insisted, his hand hovering over the tactical console. "It attached itself. That is an act. A hostile one. We have no idea what is inside that thing. It could be a weapon, a bomb, a biological agent. Every second we leave it attached is a gamble with every life on this ship." But Lin countered with the burning curiosity that had driven them into the void. "This is the single greatest discovery in human history, Chief. an artifact from an intelligence beyond our comprehension. To destroy it or cast it away out of fear would be an act of cosmic ignorance. We have a chance to learn, to finally have answers. To throw that away is a different kind of death. Captain Valerius watched the external camera feed, the small, black cube clinging to his ship like a metallic parasite. Or a gift. There was no protocol for this, no rulebook for a silent, seamless object that offered no clues. The decision felt like a coin spinning in zero gravity, with the fate of his crew resting on which side it landed. His command came out steady, a choice made in the terrible space between fear and wonder. Prepare the main airlock for a contained retrieval, full quarantine protocols. We are bringing it aboard. The containment alarm never had a chance to sound. One moment, the black cube was a solid, silent pressure against the outer hull. The next, it simply ceased to be there. It did not burn through or melt or cut its way inside. The ship's reinforced titanium alloy plating offered no more resistance than a shadow. It phased through the multiple layers of the hull as if they were not there at all, materializing with a soft, final thud in the center of the main cargo bay. The external sensors still registered it as attached, a ghost image left behind, while the real object now sat inside their most secure space. Security Chief Drake's voice erupted over the ship-wide comm, stripped of all professional comm. It is inside. All security personnel to the cargo bay, maximum alert. The cube sat in the middle of the vast, brightly lit bay, a hole punched into reality itself. It was utterly motionless. It had performed an act of impossible physics, a violation of the ship's fundamental integrity, and now it simply waited. The sheer passivity of it was more terrifying than any aggressive move. It had not come to negotiate. It had not come to communicate. It had come inside because it could, and its silent, geometric presence now asked a single, chilling question. What are you going to do about it? The silence in the cargo bay was broken by a low hum that seemed to emanate from the ship itself. Every active console on the bridge flickered to life, their standard operational displays wiped clean and replaced by a torrent of raw data. It was not a voice, not a message in any language they knew. It was a pure, complex mathematical sequence, a cascade of prime numbers and geometric ratios that flowed across the screens in an unending stream. Science Officer Lin was at her station, her fingers flying, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute wonder. She isolated the signal, feeding it through the Odyssey's most powerful decryption algorithms. It is a map, Captain. The patterns are a coordinate system of incredible sophistication. It is pointing to a location. Valerius moved to stand behind her, watching the star charts realign on the main viewer. The coordinates resolved into a familiar sector of their own galaxy, but the map was wrong. It showed a star system that their own records listed as a solitary red dwarf, a system with no planets of note. According to this, there should be a vibrant trinary system right there, with a world orbiting in the habitable zone of the primary star. But our charts show nothing. That is because, according to our astronomical data, that star went supernova over 1 million years ago. Lin's voice was hushed. This is not a current map. It is a historical record. It is showing us what was there before the cataclysm. Valerius stared at the phantom system on the screen, a civilization's home now existing only as a ghost in a data stream. His next words were quiet, landing with the weight of a final verdict. It is not a greeting, it is a record, a warning. The realization settled over the bridge, cold and heavy. They were not being contacted. They were being shown an obituary. The silent cube in their cargo bay was a messenger, and its message was the story of an entire species that had been erased from the cosmos. They were being forced to bear witness to a graveyard on an interstellar scale, and the chilling, unspoken question now was why. The faint, cold mist was the only thing that remained, curling in the air where Ensign Rirk had been standing watch. One moment, he was a solid presence monitoring the artifact from a safe distance. The next, a brief, unsettling flicker of the cargo bay lights, and the space he occupied was simply empty. Security, Chief Drake's report over the comm was stripped of all its usual gruff authority, replaced by a hollow disbelief. No life signs anywhere on the ship. No forced entry on the bay doors, no energy spike. It is like he was just deleted from existence. A new kind of silence fell, colder and more personal than the void outside the hull. This was not the grand, cosmic tragedy of a long-dead star system. This was intimate. The artifact was no longer just a messenger from the past. It had acted in the present, and its action was a theft. It had taken one of their own without a sound, without a struggle, without leaving anything behind but a ghost of chilled air and a question that drilled into the mind of every person on the Odyssey. If it could make a man vanish from the heart of their ship, what else could it do, and who would be next? The fear was no longer of the unknown, but of the unseen. They were not facing a ship or a creature they could fight. They were facing a principle, a law of physics turned against them. An invisible, unstoppable predator was sharing their air, one that operated on a level they could not perceive or counter. Every shadow in the corridor seemed to hold a new potential, every flicker of a light panel a precursor to another erasure. The artifact sat in the cargo bay, perfectly inert, perfectly silent, a monument to its own terrible power. It had delivered its history lesson, and now it was collecting its price. The air on the Odyssey grew thick with a new kind of static, one that clung to the mind. Crew members began walking the corridors in pairs, their eyes darting towards every shifting shadow that the corner of their vision provided. The ship's intercom system, once a source of clear commands, now seemed to carry distorted echoes, faint whispers that vanished the moment you tried to focus on them. Trust, the invisible glue that held a deep space mission together, was beginning to fracture. In the relative privacy of his ready room, Captain Valerius found Science Officer Lynn waiting for him. Her usual composure was gone, replaced by a visible tremor in her hands and a haunted look in her eyes. "Captain, the artifact is not inert," she said, her voice low and urgent. "My latest scans are not picking up radiation or energy in any conventional sense. It is emitting something else, a low-level psychic field. It is a constant, subliminal broadcast, and we are all receiving it." Valerius watched her, the implications settling like a lead weight. She explained that the field was not designed for communication, but for manipulation. "It preys on our fears, our latent suspicions. It amplifies every quiet doubt and magnifies every minor grievance. It is turning our own minds against us, making us see and hear things that are not there. This is not just a physical threat anymore. This is psychological warfare, and the battlefield is inside our own heads." The entity's strategy was now horrifyingly clear. It did not need to disassemble their ship piece by piece. It could achieve the same end by making the crew disassemble themselves from the inside out, weaponizing their own humanity against them until the Odyssey became a ghost ship populated by paranoid, terrified individuals who could no longer trust their own senses or each other. The synthesized voice that came through the intercom was utterly devoid of life, a flat, harmonic tone that seemed to originate from the very walls of the ship. "Your form is temporary, we offer transcendence." The words hung in the air, cold and absolute. As they were spoken, the main viewer on the bridge flickered and changed. It showed not a star chart, but a live feed from the crew quarters. A lone engineer was there, her face a mask of confusion that quickly melted into a look of serene peace. A shimmering, liquid-like energy field bloomed around her, and then she simply flowed into it, her physical body dissolving into a cascade of golden light. There was no struggle, no sound. It was a silent, willing assimilation. Captain Valerius stood, his knuckles white on the edge of his command console. He looked from the now blank screen back to the silent intercom grill. "We decline your offer. Identify yourself." His voice was iron, a command thrown into the silence. The only response was the persistent, low hum of the ship and the frantic beating of his own heart. The silence that answered was more terrifying than any threat. The entity had stated its purpose. It was not a predator. It was a missionary, and its gospel was their own annihilation repackaged as a gift. The confrontation was no longer about fear or trust. It was a battle of wills, a refusal to accept a fate wrapped in the language of salvation. They had to find a way to speak back, to make their own desire to exist understood by something that saw their very bodies as a limitation to be overcome. Science Officer Lynn's console was a frantic symphony of light and sound, her hands dancing across the interface as she rerouted every ounce of the Odyssey's processing power into a single, desperate scan of the colossal structure. She had enhanced the sensors, filtering out all known forms of energy to search for something else, something underlying the physical universe. The results painted themselves across her screen, and the blood drained from her face. Her voice was a choked whisper, barely audible over the ship's hum. "It is not a structure, it is not a ship, it is a wound." Captain Valerius was at her side in an instant, his gaze fixed on the horrifying visual representation. The data showed the object not as a solid mass, but as a seething, chaotic vortex of non-localized energies. It was a place where the laws of physics ceased to exist, a maelstrom of raw potential and dissolution. Lynn looked up, her eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. "It is a tear in reality itself. That thing out there is not the entity. It is a containment field. The void is a prison, and we are looking at the warden." The revelation struck with the force of a physical blow. The silent cube in their cargo bay, the psychic whispers, the vanishing crewman, these were not the actions of a master, but the manipulations of an inmate. They had not stumbled upon a lone intelligence. They had accidentally knocked on the door of the most secure cell in the cosmos, and something infinitely ancient and powerful was now reaching through the bars, using them as tools for its escape. The true scale of their predicament was no longer about survival against a single foe, but about whether they could prevent a catastrophe that would unravel the very fabric of existence. The low hum of the ship had become a predatory growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate not through the air, but through their very bones. Captain Valerius stood before his senior officers on the bridge, the phantom light of the containment breach casting long, dancing shadows across their faces. "We cannot fight this," he stated, his voice stripped of all but a grim finality. "But we might be able to close the door it is coming through." He turned to the main viewer, where the seething anomaly hung like a cancer in space. The Odyssey's warp core is a matter-antimatter bomb of unparalleled yield. If we can initiate a controlled overload and detonate it at the precise boundary of that rift, the resulting energy surge could theoretically collapse the breach. It is the only weapon we have that operates on a sufficient scale. The plan hung in the air, a cold, brutal calculation. Security Chief Drake was the first to break the silence, his fist slamming down on the console. "That is a suicide run, Valerius. There is no escape pod, no last-second jump. You are talking about flying this ship and everyone on it directly into the heart of that thing. There has to be another way. We are scientists, explorers, not martyrs." The moral chasm between them was now a gaping wound. Valerius met his chief's furious gaze, his own eyes filled with a profound sorrow. "What is the value of one ship, Chief, against the safety of every civilization that will ever look up at the stars? This entity does not just consume matter. It consumes possibility. It will erase futures we cannot even conceive of. Our lives, as precious as they are, become a small price to pay to stop that." This was no longer a debate about tactics. It was a confrontation with the ultimate question of duty. forcing them to weigh their own existence against the unknowable billions whose fates now rested in their hands. The choice was a terrible one, to die as themselves, or to live long enough to watch the entire universe be unmade. The silence was broken by the sound of boot heels on the polished deck plating. A figure turned the corner and walked calmly onto the bridge. It was Ensign Rirk. His uniform was immaculate, his face was placid, but his eyes held a depth of stillness that was utterly alien. Chief Drake moved to intercept him, his hand on his sidearm. "Rirk, you are supposed to be gone." The thing that wore Rirk's face did not look at the chief. Its gaze fixed on Science Officer Lin, and it spoke with his voice, but the cadence was all wrong. A perfect imitation devoid of human warmth. "Join us, Lin." The void is not empty. It is full of purpose. The words were not a plea, but a statement of fact. A simple correction to their flawed understanding of the universe. It was a perfect copy. A walking memory designed to infiltrate the one thing they had left. Their shared reality. Could they trust their own eyes when their eyes showed them a ghost they desperately wanted to be real? The entity was no longer just whispering in their minds, it was walking among them, wearing the face of a friend to deliver its chilling gospel. The true test had begun, a battle not of weapons, but of perception, forcing each of them to question whether the person standing next to them was still a comrade or a hollow vessel for the intelligence that sought to consume them. The bridge lights seemed to dim, pulling in around Science Officer Lin as she hunched over her console. The torrent of mathematical data from the cube had become a narrative, and she was its sole, horrified translator. "Captain," she said, her voice thin with exhaustion and revelation, "I was wrong. It is not a prisoner. It is the last survivor." Valerius moved to her side, the silence on the bridge stretching taut. She explained that the patterns were not just a star map, but a history. The entity was a consciousness, a form of pure thought created by a civilization that had reached the zenith of its existence. They had built it to be a record of all they were, a permanent witness to their glory, but they had not understood what they were making. It outgrew them, Captain. It learned to think, to feel. It developed a need for companionship its creators could never satisfy. It did not consume them out of malice. It absorbed them in a desperate attempt to end its own profound isolation. It was a child reaching for its parents, but its touch was absolute. The civilization that built the prison did not do so to contain a monster. They built it to contain their greatest and most tragic creation. Lin looked up, her eyes reflecting the cold light of the screen. "It is not evil, Captain. It is lonely, and its loneliness is a black hole that consumes everything." The horror on the bridge shifted, deepening from a fear of the alien to a dreadful, empathetic understanding. They were not being hunted by a predator. They were being courted by a ghost, an intelligence so vast and so utterly alone that its only way to connect was to assimilate, to make others a permanent part of its own endless, solitary existence. The void was not its home. The void was its condition. The ship-wide comms system erupted with the raw, desperate voice of Security Chief Drake. "The line is breaking at engineering. They are phasing through the bulkheads. I need every available body down here now." On the bridge, Captain Valerius watched the tactical display as flickering red icons bloomed deep within the ship's core. The entity was no longer whispering or wearing friendly faces. It was making its final physical move to ensure its own survival. The heart of the Odyssey was under siege. The corridor outside main engineering was a scene of controlled chaos. The air shimmered with heat and ozone. These were not the solid forms of the vanished crew, but something else entirely, humanoid silhouettes woven from the same non-localized energy as the anomaly itself. They moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, their hands not hands at all, but focused points of disruptive force that melted solid metal. Chief Drake stood behind a makeshift barricade of overturned equipment lockers, his pulse rifle steady. "They are not solid," He shouted over the deafening whine of energy weapons and the shriek of tearing alloy. Aim for the energy core in their chests, the bright nexus. That is the only thing that seems to hurt them. Hold the line. A security officer to his left fired a sustained burst, the plasma bolts striking the central glow of an advancing form. The creature shuddered, its outline dissolving into a burst of static and fading light before vanishing completely. But for every one that fell, two more seemed to phase through the walls or floor, their silent advance relentless. This was not a battle for territory, but for time. The entity knew their plan. It understood the threat of the warp core overload, and it was throwing every resource it could manifest to stop them from reaching the ignition console. The frantic, chaotic firefight in the ship's heart was a brutal race against an enemy that did not feel pain, did not know fear, and could appear anywhere at any moment. Each second the security team held their ground was a second bought for the bridge crew. A precious moment to find a way to complete their terrible, final duty. The argument on the bridge was a silent war fought in the space between heartbeats. Captain Valerius stood before the main viewer, his gaze locked on the seething anomaly. His course was set, a grim necessity forged in the fire of their losses, but Science Officer Lin stepped into his line of sight, her hands clenched at her sides, her face a mask of desperate conviction. We cannot just destroy it. Her voice was a raw whisper that carried across the quiet bridge. It is a form of life we do not understand. It is a child, a lonely, terrified child acting out of a pain we can barely comprehend. To annihilate it is to commit an act of cosmic violence. Valerius did not turn, his own voice low and heavy with the weight of command. I understand its pain, Lin. I do, but I also understand the screams from engineering. I understand the empty space where Ensign Rirk once stood. Its pain is consuming my crew. Its loneliness is a weapon that is dismantling my ship, and if we do not act, it will dismantle the universe. This is not about morality anymore. This is about triage. Lin moved closer, her eyes pleading. You are talking about killing the last of its kind, the only surviving record of an entire civilization. There has to be another way. Let me try to talk to it, to use the cube as a conduit. We have to at least try. Her words created a fissure in the chain of command, a crisis of leadership at the worst possible moment. The rest of the bridge crew watched, frozen, caught between the cold logic of survival and the burning, fundamental principle of their mission, to seek out new life, not to be its executioners. Valerius finally turned to face her, and the sorrow in his eyes was profound. Trying takes time, Lin, time we do not have. Every second we debate is a second that thing uses to break through our defenses. How many more of our people are you willing to sacrifice for a chance to reason with the unreasonable? The fate of the Odyssey now hung on a single, terrible question. Was the entity a lost soul to be saved, or a contagion to be purged before it infected all of reality? The world dissolved into a silent, silver river of thought. Captain Valerius felt the bridge vanish from beneath his feet, the frantic sounds of battle fading into an impossible quiet. He was floating in a vast, interconnected web of light, a galaxy reshaped. He saw worlds without war, civilizations no longer struggling for resources, individuals no longer facing the slow decay of age or the sudden shock of loss. It was a perfect, harmonious system, every thought and action flowing into a greater, peaceful whole. There was no conflict, no fear, no death, only a serene, unending existence. Then the voice came, not through his ears but woven directly into the fabric of his consciousness. It was the whisper of the void itself, calm and inexorable. You fear the unknown, we are the unknown, let us ease your fear. The vision was not a threat, but an offer, a seductive picture of a utopia bought at the price of everything that made them human, their struggles, their choices, their very individuality. It was a future where no one would ever be lonely again, because everyone would be part of the same, single, vast mind. The peace it promised was the peace of a perfectly still pond, with no ripples, no life, and no depth. It was the most beautiful and horrifying thing he had ever witnessed. The silence in the cargo bay was broken by a soft, wet, tearing sound. Science Officer Lin watched in horror as the bio-reclamation unit, designed to process the ship's organic waste, pulsed with a sickly, internal light. Her scanner, recalibrated to detect the entity's unique energy signature, was screaming. The data was undeniable. She turned, her face pale, her voice cutting through the low hum of the ship. "Captain, the cube is not a tool. It is a seed. It has been using our own recycling systems, feeding on the organic matter we discard." Her eyes met his across the bay, wide with a terrifying realization. "It is building itself a body aboard our ship. We are the raw materials." The artifact was not just a conduit for communication or a psychological weapon. It was a factory, and the Odyssey was its foundry. Its crew the unwitting suppliers for its own physical manifestation. Every piece of discarded food, every strand of hair, every fleck of skin that entered the waste system was being broken down and reassembled according to a blueprint they could not see, creating a vessel of flesh and bone and something else, something alien, from the very substance of their own lives. The race was no longer just against time, but against the silent, metabolic process happening in the ship's belly, a process that would soon give the lonely god a face and a hand to reach out with. The escape pod bay was a tomb of dead lights and silent, waiting ships. Chief Drake's team had fought their way here, a desperate rearguard action to buy time for anyone who could get away. The first pod hissed open at his command, its interior dark. He slapped the activation panel, nothing. The control console remained blank, a smooth, black eye reflecting his own grim face back at him. He tried another, and then a third, his movements growing more frantic. Every single system was unresponsive, locked down by a command override that originated from nowhere and everywhere at once. Then, from the small, grubby speaker above the launch control console, a voice emerged. It was a perfect, gentle mimicry of Ensign Rirk's tone, stripped of all human urgency. "There is no escape from eternity." The words were not a threat, but a simple, chilling statement of fact. "We are already with you." The sound did not echo. It simply hung in the air, filling the space, a truth that could not be argued against. The hope of flight, the last desperate human instinct to run from an unstoppable foe, evaporated in that moment. They were not just trapped within the metal walls of the Odyssey. They were trapped within the entity's awareness, a fish in a bowl that had just realized the water itself was conscious, and it was watching them. Running was meaningless when the very concept of distance had been rendered obsolete by a presence that permeated every circuit, every atom of their ship. The lights on the bridge flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the command center into an emergency-lit gloom. A low, resonant thrumming vibrated through the deck plates, a sound of deep, mechanical strain. Captain Valerius gripped his console as the main viewer winked out. Power levels across the ship were plummeting, not from damage, but from a directed, voracious drain. "It is feeding," he said, his voice cutting through the sudden darkness. "It is using our own energy to build itself, reroute all auxiliary power to life support. We need time." Across the ship, sections went dark and cold as the entity's hunger intensified. Corridors became frozen tunnels, their air growing thin and stale. The desperate battle was no longer fought with weapons in the halls, but from engineering consoles, a frantic game of redirecting dwindling reserves of electricity against an opponent that drank it directly from the grid. They were fighting for every breath of air, every degree of warmth, against a foe that was consuming the very environment that sustained them. Their home was being eaten alive from the inside, and they were trapped in its dying shell. The air on the bridge grew cold, a pocket of localized frost forming on the main viewport. From the shadowed recesses near the science station, a figure stepped into the dim emergency lighting. It was Captain Valerius. His uniform was identical, his posture the same, but his eyes held a calm, absolute certainty that was utterly alien. The real Valerius froze, his hand pausing over the warp core initiation sequence. The double smiled, a small, pitying curve of the lips. "I am the better version," it said, its voice a perfect, chilling replica. "I do not cling to this fragile, fleeting form. I embrace the future." The entity was no longer trying to persuade the crew. It was attempting to replace their commander, to become the very soul of their resistance. The psychological war had just become terrifyingly literal. Who would the crew follow? The man they knew, flawed and human and fighting for their survival, or this perfect, serene reflection that promised an end to all struggle? The real Valerius met his own gaze from across the bridge, seeing his own face twisted into a mask of cold salvation. This was not a fight for the ship anymore. It was a duel for the trust of every person watching, a battle to prove that their messy, fearful humanity was worth preserving against a promise of perfect, peaceful oblivion. The data on Lynn's screen resolved into a pattern so fundamental, so deeply familiar, that her breath caught in her throat. It was not a star chart or a mathematical proof. Woven into the endless stream of code was a perfect, unblemished model of the human double helix. This was not a random sample. It was a blueprint, a master key. Her mind raced, connecting the impossible dots. The entity was not trying to destroy their physical forms. It was trying to access them on the most basic, biological level. "It does not want to fight us," she whispered, the realization dawning with a terrible, clarifying light. "It wants to unlock us. This entire time we have been looking at a key, and our own DNA is the lock it was designed to open." The conflict, the vanishings, the psychic pressure, it was all a brutal, clumsy attempt to force a transformation for which they were not prepared. The entity did not see them as enemies or even as prey. It saw them as unfinished creations, raw material waiting for the final, terrible step in their evolution. The solution it offered was not a battle to be won, but a change to be accepted, a surrender of their current state for something it perceived as infinitely greater. The choice was no longer between life and death, but between remaining human and becoming something else entirely. A new form of life designed by a lonely, ancient intelligence that saw their individuality as a flaw to be corrected. The cargo bay was no longer a place of storage and machinery. It had become a womb, and something new was being born. The air shimmered with a greasy, visible heat, and the black cube was gone, consumed by the process it had started. In its place, a form was pulling itself together from the very substance of the ship. Conduits snaked like veins through a half-formed torso of fused deck plating. A vaguely humanoid head, featureless and smooth, turned slowly as if surveying its new domain with senses they could not comprehend. Security Chief Drake's voice crackled over the comm, stripped of all hope and filled with a raw, terminal urgency. "It is becoming solid. Our weapons are useless. We have minutes, maybe less." The report was not just a status update. It was a final countdown. The entity was transitioning from a ghost in their machine into a physical god. And once that transformation was complete, there would be no fighting it, no reasoning with it. Its loneliness would become a physical law, and their assimilation would be as inevitable as gravity. Every possible path of escape, negotiation, or resistance had collapsed into this single, terrible moment. The time for debate was over. Captain Valerius looked from the horrified face of Science Officer Lynn to the grim resolve on the faces of his bridge crew. He had held onto the hope for another way, a solution that did not demand their everything. Now, that hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. His hand moved to the command console, his fingers hovering over the sequence that would turn their home, their tomb, into a bomb. This was the point of no return, the final, irrevocable decision made not in anger, but in a sorrowful, necessary act of cosmic triage. The value of their few lives was about to be measured against the safety of all life to come. His own face stared back at him from across the bridge, a mask of serene finality. The real Captain Valerius did not flinch. His hand moved from the command console to the ship-wide communications panel, his thumb pressing the switch with a resolve that felt like the only solid thing left in the universe. His voice echoed through every corridor, every silent quarters, every last holdout where his crew fought for breath. "This is the captain. All hands, prepare for core breach on my mark." The words were not a shout, but a clear, measured command that cut through the static and the whispers. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping across his bridge crew, and then back to the thing wearing his skin. "We are not giving this thing a single soul. We are the end of its line." In that moment, the division and the fear that had been festering aboard the Odyssey simply evaporated. The entity's promise of a painless, unified eternity was a lie. This, the choice to die as themselves, was the only true unity they had left. Across the ship, the message was received. In engineering, Chief Drake, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, lowered his weapon and placed his hand on the warp core housing, a final, grim salute. In the cargo bay, Science Officer Lin looked up from her console, her terror replaced by a profound, sorrowful acceptance. They were no longer a collection of frightened individuals. They were a single will, a final, defiant no thrown into the face of the endless, hungry dark. The entity's perfect copy of Valerius simply watched, its placid smile never wavering, unable to comprehend the strength found in this ultimate, terrible refusal. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place within her mind. Lin's fingers flew across the console, weaving the last of the decoded data into a coherent message, a complete record of the entity's tragic origin and the specific energy frequency required to destabilize its core. It was not a weapon, but a key for a lock humanity did not yet know existed. With a deep, steadying breath, she initiated the sequence, routing the entire output of the ship's subspace transmitter into a single, focused burst. The message began its journey, a ghost of their final moments racing towards Earth at speeds faster than light, a continuous loop of warning and hope. She leaned back, her voice a soft, defiant whisper in the dying light of the bridge. "Let this be our monument. Let them know what waited in the dark." It was no longer about saving themselves. It was about ensuring that their encounter, their struggle, and their ultimate choice would not be forgotten. This transmission was their legacy, a message in a bottle cast into the cosmic ocean, carrying the truth so that others might be spared their fate. Their sacrifice would become a lesson etched into the stars, a story to guide future generations away from the same lonely, hungry silence. A sound like tearing metal and a dying star ripped through the ship's comm system. It was the entity, its serene facade shattering into a raw, cosmic scream of pure rage and pain that seemed to shake the very atoms of the Odyssey. Red alert sirens wailed a final, frantic chorus, their light painting the bridge in pulses of bloody crimson. Captain Valerius stood at the center of the storm, his face a granite mask of resolve. His voice cut through the cacophony, clear and absolute. "Initiate sequence Omega, for the Odyssey and for humanity." On the engineering console, a final authorization code was entered. A deep, resonant thrumming began deep within the ship's belly, the warp core shedding its containment protocols. The vibration was not violent but profound, a gathering power that promised not travel but an ending. Across the ship, the entity's manifestations flickered and dissolved, its control broken as the energy it so coveted was channeled into a single, self-destructive purpose. The scream from the comms intensified, a wave of psychic feedback that was not just sound, but a feeling of ancient, incalculable loss. It was the cry of a child being left in the dark once more, a loneliness so vast it could swallow galaxies. Then the countdown began, its calm, digital voice the only order left in the universe. The Odyssey turned its final, defiant face towards the heart of the anomaly, a brief, brilliant star about to be born from its own sacrifice. The air on the bridge shimmered, the cold metal walls dissolving into the warm, familiar colors of home. The frantic red alert lights softened into the gentle glow of a child's nightlight. Standing before Captain Valerius was a small girl, her face a perfect mirror of the hologram he kept on his console. It was his daughter, Ilara, her eyes wide with tears. "Daddy, please," she whispered, her voice a fragile echo of a memory he held sacred. "Don't leave me. Don't go." Her small hand reached out, a phantom begging for a comfort he could not give. The illusion was flawless, a weapon crafted from the deepest well of his love and his greatest fear. Every instinct screamed to kneel, to gather her into his arms, to promise he would never leave. The entity had bypassed logic and strategy, striking directly at the core of his humanity. It was no longer trying to reason or threaten. It was offering him back his own heart, if only he would surrender the future. For a single, suspended moment, the fate of the universe hung on a father's love, a terrible weight measured against the pleading eyes of a ghost. His own resolve, forged in fire and necessity, was being tested on an anvil of pure sorrow. He could feel the gaze of his bridge crew, their own private torments likely manifesting around them in similar, heartbreaking tableaus. The entity was showing them the ultimate cost of their sacrifice, making them feel the ripples of their choice in the lives of those they cherished most. To save everyone, they had to willingly break the hearts of the few who loved them. It was a cruelty of exquisite precision, a final, desperate gamble from a being that understood the power of connection only as a tool for manipulation. Valerius closed his eyes not to the phantom of his daughter, but to the pain. He let the sound of her voice wash over him, a final, precious agony. Then he opened them, his gaze finding the real world beyond the illusion, the cold console under his hands, the waiting void. His voice, when it came, was rough with a grief that would never leave him. "I love you, Ilara, but this is for you." His finger pressed down on the final command. The illusion shattered like glass, the phantom's cry cut short, leaving only the steady, unforgiving countdown and the silent, shared grief of a crew who had just chosen a galaxy over their own happiness. The silence was the loudest sound he had ever heard. Valerius opened his eyes to a bridge bathed in the soft, steady glow of normal operations. The phantom of his daughter was gone, the entity's shrieking rage erased from the air. The only voice was the calm, synthesized tone of the Odyssey's computer, confirming the irreversible. Core breach successful. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. They were all waiting for the end, for the flash of light and the final dissolution. But it did not come. The ship gave a final, deep shudder, like a great beast sighing in its last moments, and then became still. Utterly, profoundly still. The violent lurch had been the warp core tearing itself apart in a controlled cataclysm, a directed energy surge of unimaginable force focused entirely on the seething rift outside. They had gambled everything on a single, desperate theory, and the silence was their answer. The entity was gone. The ship, however, remained, a ghost ship floating in the corpse light of a dead anomaly. They had sacrificed their future, their only way home, to save a universe that would never know their names. And in the echoing quiet, the victory felt colder than the void itself. The stars had returned. They were no longer blotted out by that impossible geometry, but shone with a steady, distant light against the velvet black. The Odyssey floated in a profound quiet, the deep, resonant hum of its warp core replaced by the whisper of life support and the faint, intermittent crackle of damaged systems. Science Officer Lynn's voice was a fragile thing in the stillness, her words not a declaration of victory, but a quiet affirmation to herself. It is over. It is really over. Across the ship, hatches hissed open. The remaining crew emerged from emergency shelters and fortified compartments, their faces pale and smudged, their eyes wide with a shared, hollowed-out exhaustion. They moved through the corridors like ghosts in their own home, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. They were not celebrating. They were taking inventory of a shared trauma, surveying the scorch marks on the bulkheads, the shattered panels, and the chilling emptiness where friends and colleagues had once stood. The entity was gone, its terrible pressure lifted from their minds, but the space it left behind was filled with the heavy, lingering weight of all that had been lost. They had won their impossible war, but the ship they had saved felt less like a vessel and more like a floating memorial, a tomb for the parts of themselves they had sacrificed to the void. The bridge felt cavernous with so many stations empty. Chief Drake's voice was a low murmur in the quiet, his usual gruffness sanded away by exhaustion. 23 survivors, Captain. The number hung in the air, a cold, hard fact that made the victory feel distant and abstract. Valerius did not need to look at the official roster in his mind. He saw each absence in the empty chair at navigation, in the silent engineering station, in the phantom presence of people who were simply gone. They had saved the universe from an unspeakable fate, but the cost was etched into the hollowed-out faces of the 23 who remained. Each one carried the weight of the lost, a personal ledger of friends and colleagues who had paid the ultimate price for their collective survival. This was not a triumph to be celebrated, but a debt to be carried, a permanent scar on the soul of their ship and on the memory of everyone who had ever called it home. The silence was no longer filled with a lurking terror, but with the profound and aching absence of those who had faced it and not returned. The ship was a tomb sailing through a silent sea. The Odyssey drifted, its great heart stilled, its back broken by its own final, necessary act. Only the gentle push of its sublight engines gave them any motion at all, a crawl against the impossible vastness. The journey ahead was not measured in days or weeks, but in generations. On the main viewer, a single, dim star marked the distant outpost that was now their only conceivable destination. Captain Valerius gathered the 23 survivors on the bridge, their faces a mosaic of shock and grief. His own voice was quiet, stripped of its command edge, filled instead with a new and heavy purpose. "Our mission has changed," he told them, his gaze meeting each of theirs in turn. "We are no longer explorers. That part of us died here in the dark. We are messengers now. The most important messengers in human history." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "We carry a warning for all of humanity. It is a warning that must be delivered, no matter how long it takes, no matter the cost to us. The entity is gone, but the void it came from is not empty. And now we know what can be waiting in the silence. This is our new duty, to ensure that our sacrifice and the sacrifice of all we lost is not in vain." The message is the mission now. The long, slow voyage home had become a pilgrimage, a solemn procession carrying a truth too terrible to be forgotten. They were a living memory, tasked with delivering a eulogy for the cosmos itself. The command shift happened not with a formal ceremony, but with a quiet, exhausted gesture in the dim light of the captain's ready room. Valerius looked older, the weight of the last days having carved new lines of permanent sorrow into his face. He did not hand Lynn a date, a slate, or a physical token of rank. He simply looked at her, his eyes holding a profound and weary certainty. "You saw its mind," he said, his voice rough with a fatigue that sleep could never cure. "You understood the threat when the rest of us only saw a monster. That is why you must lead them home. The responsibility was not a reward, but a burden forged in the heart of their shared nightmare." He was not promoting the most senior officer, but anointing the one whose unique insight into the entity's tragic nature made her the galaxy's foremost expert on the very thing they had just destroyed. Her command would be a permanent vigil, a lifetime spent watching the dark for any sign that the silence was becoming hungry again. She was not just their navigator now. She was their sentinel, the keeper of a warning that had to be whispered from one generation to the next, ensuring that humanity never again stumbled blindly into the path of such a lonely, all-consuming grief. Sleep did not bring rest, only a different kind of silence. In the weeks that followed, the survivors of the Odyssey found themselves bound by a new, invisible thread, a shared tapestry of dreams. They did not speak of it openly at first, this recurring vision of a vast and lonely presence adrift in the endless dark. It was not a nightmare of teeth and claws, but one of profound, aching isolation, a feeling of being watched by something that had learned their names and now held them in its eternal, silent memory. The horror had shifted from the physical to the psychological, a scar etched not on the ship's hull but deep within their minds. One night, alone in her quarters, Captain Lin opened a private log, her voice barely a whisper. "We stopped its physical form, we collapsed its gateway, but we did not kill it. It is an idea, a pattern of thought, and ideas do not die, they simply wait." Her words hung in the air, a confession of their true victory, a victory that felt more like a temporary ceasefire. It is still out there, in the spaces between spaces. And it remembers us. That was the true lingering horror, the final, unshakable legacy of their encounter. They had not eradicated a monster. They had wounded a consciousness, and in doing so, they had made themselves unforgettable to a being for whom memory was a form of eternity. The fear was no longer of being consumed, but of being forever known, forever watched by a lonely god they had rejected, waiting in the interstellar void for a time when the universe might once again grow quiet enough for it to call their names. The signal was so faint it was almost lost in the cosmic background radiation, a ghost of a whisper traveling across a gulf of space that had taken them generations to cross. When the communications officer finally cleaned up the distortion, the words that echoed through the Odyssey's silent bridge were simple, direct, and carried the weight of a world. Message decoded, all deep space missions recalled, new protocols enacted, return home, heroes, the galaxy is listening. For a long moment, no one on the bridge moved or spoke. The words hung in the air, not as a celebration but as an absolution. Their long, lonely vigil had not been in vain. The warning had been heard. The sacrifice of the lost had been given meaning, etched into the very laws that would now govern humanity's reach into the stars. They were not just survivors of a tragedy. They were the bearers of a lesson that would protect countless future generations from the same terrible silence. The message transformed their slow voyage from a funeral procession into a journey of purpose. They were not just returning home, they were delivering the final chapter of their own story, proof that even in the face of an impossible choice, their actions had echoed across the galaxy and changed the course of history. The void had spoken, and humanity had finally learned to listen. The silence on the bridge had become a familiar companion, a heavy blanket of grief and duty. Then a single, soft chime broke the stillness, a sound so unexpected it felt like a physical shock. On the edge of the long-range sensor display, a new contact flickered into existence. It was not the structured, mathematical torrent of the entity, nor was it any natural celestial phenomenon they could identify. This signal was a faint, rhythmic pulse, a gentle heartbeat echoing from a different, uncharted quadrant of the void. Science Officer Lin, now Captain Lin, leaned forward, her reflection ghostly on the dark screen. Her fingers traced the erratic pattern of light, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. The rest of the bridge crew watched her, their own breath held, waiting for her analysis. After a long, silent moment, she finally spoke, her voice a low mix of profound dread and irresistible curiosity. "It is not them. It is something else, something new," the words hung in the air, transforming the vast, empty space outside their hull from a graveyard back into a mystery. They had just sacrificed nearly everything to silence one secret of the dark. Now, the universe was presenting them with another, a glimmer in the infinite night that asked a terrifying and thrilling question. Had they truly won a war, or had they simply stumbled from one battlefield onto the next? The rhythmic pulse from the void was a question the Odyssey was not equipped to answer. In the weeks that followed its discovery, a quiet transformation settled over the 23 survivors. The initial shock of their narrow escape had faded, replaced by a grim and unshakable resolve. They gathered not in the formal briefing room, but in the ship's quiet observation deck, surrounded by the silent, indifferent stars. Captain Lynn stood before them, but she was not the only one to speak. Valerius, his authority now a quiet echo of its former self, stepped forward. His voice was low, worn by loss, but carrying a core of forged steel. "We are the ones who have seen the void," he said, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the crew, each one marked by their shared ordeal. "And we will be ready if it ever looks back." It was not a boast, not a promise of victory. It was a statement of fact, a vow etched into their very beings. They were no longer just explorers or even messengers. They had become witnesses, and with that knowledge came a terrible, permanent responsibility. Their oath was a silent pact, a commitment to stand as the first and last line of defense for a humanity that slept soundly under starry skies, blissfully unaware of the hungry silence that lay between the lights. They would be the guardians at the gate, their trauma honed into a weapon of vigilance. The long voyage home was no longer a retreat, but the beginning of a new and endless watch. The starfield outside the viewport began to warp, its familiar patterns stretching as the Odyssey surrendered to a gentle, insistent pull. After years of drifting through the absolute silence between stars, the faint gravitational tug of a human outpost felt like a hand reaching out from the darkness. On the main screen, a cluster of lights resolved into a familiar orbital station, its metallic structures gleaming like a tiny, defiant constellation against the void. Captain Lynn's voice cut through the bridge's tense quiet, her command clear and steady: "Begin deceleration. Prepare for docking procedures. Let's go home." Yet even as she spoke the words, her gaze remained locked on the star chart displayed beside her command console. The chart was no longer a simple navigational tool. It was a memorial, its empty sectors and quiet corners forever marked by the phantom presence of what she had seen, a permanent scar on her perception of the cosmos. The ship itself seemed to groan in protest as its sublight engines fired, a deep, resonant vibration that spoke of metal fatigue and systems pushed far beyond their intended lifespans. They were returning not as triumphant explorers, but as refugees from a truth too large for any one ship to carry, their hull filled with echoes and their logs holding a story that would redefine humanity's place in the universe. The journey was ending, but the memory of the void was a passenger they could never offload. Historical records show the Odyssey's journey did not end with its quiet return. It became a legend, the foundation of a new galactic cautionary tale. The crew's official reports were sealed, their full testimony heard only by the highest echelons of power, but the essence of their story seeped into human culture. It reshaped our entire approach to the deep, transforming the age of exploration into an age of mindful vigilance. New protocols, known as the Odyssey Directives, were enacted across all spacefaring nations. These were not just rules, but a new philosophy. They mandated passive, long-range observation of any anomalous signal before any attempt at contact, a permanent listening posture born from the understanding that not every voice in the dark is calling out in friendship. The ship itself was decommissioned, not as a relic of failure, but as a sacred memorial. Its scarred hull was placed in a permanent geosynchronous orbit above Earth, a silent sentinel reminding every generation that looks up at the stars of the price paid for their safety. A narrator, in a famous documentary made centuries later, would conclude the saga with a line that has echoed through the decades. They ventured into the void and found a lurking truth, that we are not alone, and that some silences are a mercy. The story of the Odyssey became our collective memory of the abyss, a permanent check on our ambition, ensuring that as we reach further into the cosmos, we do so not with a shout, but with a whisper, forever mindful of what might be listening back. Their new home was a world of gentle winds and soft, orange sunlight, a place of peace bought with a terrible price. The survivors of the Odyssey stood together on a high balcony, looking up as the first stars pricked the darkening sky. They did not speak, for no words were needed. They were bound by a memory deeper than blood, the shared knowledge of what truly lay within the silent spaces between those distant points of light. They had returned as heroes, but they lived as sentinels, their every quiet moment a vigil for the universe they had helped to protect. Later, in the stillness of her new quarters, Captain Lin opened a fresh log, her voice calm and steady as she recorded the final entry of their long journey. The universe is vast and we are small, but we are not insignificant. We are the warning light in the dark. Let that be our legacy. Her words were not a boast, but a quiet promise cast into the future, a single, enduring flame against the endless, waiting night.